Attention marketers and entrepreneurs, this is Valuetising, the place where we talk about scaling brands worth promoting. If you're a mission-driven entrepreneur obsessed with creating, scaling, and exiting multi-million-dollar brands, this is for you. My name is Santiago Phoenix and I am a business growth consultant, online marketer, and investor. I have helped more than 107 and 8-figure founders increase profits, claim their time back, and transform the world. Now it's your turn. Welcome to the show. Hello and welcome to Valuetising. My guest today is Megan Helmen, a licensed pediatric neuropsychologist, a speaker and founder of Developmental Discoveries. Megan has over 20 years of experience working with children with developmental disabilities and their families, and she is a private practice owner since July 2022. Megan, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
I'm so glad that you are here today with us. Tell us a little bit about your work. What is really that you do with children? How do you help families understand their children?
Sure. Well, it started, I had an interest in working with kids with autism beginning in high school and did a lot of work in college as a respite care provider and worked in a number of settings, but heard a lot of stories from parents about how they got their child's diagnosis when they first learned that their child had autism and how basically terrible those experiences were, very cold and kind of not giving a lot of guidance or information. And I just thought, I want to do that part, but better. It's such an important moment in a family's story and in learning something important about their child. And so I just kind of followed that path through college and graduate school and fortunately get to do that kind of work on a daily basis where I'm invited into a family's story and learning about their child and kind of taking on the job of understanding what's going on and providing some education and information that allows parents to better understand what's going on so that they can make some adjustments, provide appropriate resources, follow up with schools or therapists and other outside professionals to kind of set up life in a way that works better for their unique child.
Right. So I would say I'm very ignorant in this topic. So would you say like is a children who is diagnosed with ADHD, do they have a different type
Sure.
of brain or is something that is learned, or how would you explain that?
Oh, sure. So if you think about the term diversity, if you think about racial diversity, that includes all races, right? Diversity is just variability. And so we know that brains come in many different forms. So neurodiversity kind of describes the broad range of ways that brains can be wired. And certain people, individuals come into this world with a type of brain wiring that causes them to have a different experience in terms of how they process information, how they learn, how they socialize. And so developmental disabilities, developmental referring to the fact that it's present from early in life, are things like autism, ADHD, learning disabilities, which include like dyslexia, so difficulties with reading, dysgraphia, which is difficulties with writing, and a number of others. Those are the most common. Neurodiversity includes neurodivergence, which is some of these developmental disabilities where we know the brain is wired differently, is processing and learning differently than what we call like neurotypical brains.
So when you say developmental, does it mean that it was learned and developed over time?
It's biological, so it's kind of how the brain was formed and is growing and developing kind of it's in its own way and on a different path than what would be considered typical. So it's not learned like ADHD is or autism isn't a learned set of traits and behaviors. It's innate to the person. And I think that's actually an important kind of point to start from, which is that a lot of my mission in my work is driven by this idea that it's hard to help somebody or kind of improve their quality of life if you're starting from a place of this is something that's wrong with you that we need to fix, which is kind of how developmental disabilities like ADHD and autism have been studied and taught even until very recently, and probably many places still is. And to appreciate if this is something that's part of who a person is, then should we really be calling these symptoms or should we be calling them traits? And then how do we kind of better understand who this person is and adjust life around them and teach them meaningful skills that allow them to have fewer symptoms, to be a more comfortable, successful person in their day-to-day life as the person that they are, rather than trying to get them to be somebody else or someone that is not, something outside of how their brain is wired, if that makes sense. I realize I'm speaking on a business podcast as a trained clinical psychologist, so it's helpful to be reminded of what's kind of not common knowledge.
Yeah, but the reason why I think this is very important for entrepreneurs is because a lot of us we talk about entrepreneurial ADHD. I don't think
100% entrepreneurs have a higher rate of ADHD because the ADHD brain is wired in a way that provides certain strengths that lend well to entrepreneurialism. So to all the entrepreneurs listening, probably a lot of you are neurodivergent, whether or not that's been formally identified. But if you can relate to this idea of kind of noticing that your way of being in the world differs from others, that you get a million ideas, you're extremely creative, you're impulsive, which is a two-sided coin, right? Like that might harm you in some moments, but also makes you a risk taker and willing to try new things that others might not. You might notice details and have, think on a level that others don't even consider because of your giftedness or your ADHD or your autism. You have a special interest that really drives you, and not everybody operates that way. So, a disability can also come with traits that work really well in certain settings and situations. And we know from research that there is a much higher rate of ADHD in entrepreneurs.
And what would be some ways to leverage that? Because I remember I was told to have ADHD. It wasn't a clinical diagnosis or anything like that. But yeah, how could we leverage the strengths of having that entrepreneurial ADHD?
Sure. I think that it kind of ties back into my initial, what I was talking about is just start from a foundation of better understanding. So if you can even just take on the habit of learning to observe yourself, because all of these traits, I've come to really find that a lot of ADHD or autistic traits are neutral traits, but they can be helpful or harmful depending on the situation. They can really lead to wonderful things, or they can be a great hindrance. So for example, I'll speak from my own experience, which is that I get an idea, I get really excited about the idea. Don't want to think about anything else but the idea, and I can get really ahead of my skis on planning and and then also ignoring other things that I should be doing because I'm so hyper focused on this new exciting thing I want to do. And so that's wonderful because it leads me to do things like podcasts and speaking and creating educational content and creating a business. But it also is a hindrance when now all of a sudden I'm completely overwhelmed and I've got too many things to manage and I'm not planning accordingly. So I think the best thing that anyone can do, kind of a good rule of thumb, is to just start from a place of better kind of learning and understanding about yourself and noticing this is a trait. It's part of who I am. It's not going to change. But when is it helpful and when is it harmful? Like when is it working for me? When is it working against me? Because then you can start to adjust because you're not going to change that part of who you are, but you can start to notice and adjust when it's working against you.
So it's all depending on the situation and the context.
Yeah, I think so. And when parents are trying to support their kids, if you have a child with autism, for example, and a common thing with autism is a really strong need for routine. Those kids do better if they know exactly what's going to happen, which can be great because they will keep you on a schedule and they're predictable, they're dependable, they're loyal. The problem is when the routine changes, as it inevitably does in life, then that's extremely distressing for them. Or they might impose routines on others and get very upset if others don't follow their routines. So again, it's kind of recognizing this is something that's part of who they are and how they're wired. How can we use that to their advantage? And how can we support them when it's, a hindrance to them? So you think about a job where it has to be the exact same every time. You want it done perfectly. I've seen kids their passion was airplanes, airline mechanics. I thought, you're the kid I want fixing my airplane. If you're going to do it exactly right in the exact same way every single time, I would 100% trust you to fix the airplane that I'm going to fly on. Or a surgeon, for example, right? Like there are professions where it needs to be done routinely and exactly right every time. And I'm willing to bet those same professionals in their day-to-day life have a lot of struggle in their relationships some of the time with when a partner wants to change the plan or, you know, plans are canceled or they have to kind of fly by the seat of their pants in other situations that might not lend very well to their set of traits. So it's, yeah, all about context.
Interesting. And when it comes to focus, I once read an article that said that um, that focus for how would you say like there are two types of focus. Like there is ADHD people with ADHD they can also focus, but they have a different type of focus. Is that right? Like or how does that work?
Sure. So with ADHD, I think it's helpful to, rather than think of it as an attention deficit, it's actually a problem with mediating attention. So people with ADHD have an abundance of attention. They're just not very successful at managing it appropriately or as needed. So for example, it's they're very good at hyper focusing on areas of interest. So anyone with ADHD can relate to getting really absorbed in a topic or a project, kind of going down a rabbit hole, um, which can be wonderful. It also can be a problem if you're supposed to be doing other things or you're inadvertently ignoring people and they're taking offense or any number of things. Whereas when something's not particularly interesting, it's extremely hard for the ADHD brain to maintain attention.
Mhm.
So it tends to kind of like tune in and out, or it's disengaged and thinking about other things rather than what is meant to be focused on in that moment. So a child in a classroom, the teacher might start to sound like wah, 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 like it's Charlie Brown, like the adults in Charlie Brown, if anyone remembers that cartoon. But whereas then the parents will go, well, yeah, but they can focus on video games for hours. Well, that's because the video games are extremely engaging, highly reinforcing. So yeah, the ADHD brain is just kind of has difficulty with managing attention successfully across situations.
Interesting. And what do you think of those experiments that people do, like a dopamine detox?
Oh, I mean that's real too, right? Because I mean, I don't know exactly what you're referring to. I think I'm not sure I'm
Yeah,
familiar with.
for example, they say that every time you see a social media notification, you have a small dopamine hit. So the
Uh-huh.
plan is to just eliminate all those things so your dopamine levels are reset. Is that real? Is that valid?
Sure. Yeah, because your brain gets habituated. So something that maybe, like if you can remember the first time when you started on social media and those first few hits you got like that, that's great. And then after a while you kind of habituate to that and then it doesn't feel as exciting until it's, oh, 20 people liked it or 30 people shared it or whatever. Like you become desensitized to something that was initially pleasurable, and then it takes more and more of that same input to have the same kind of neurological response. So then the problem is that you're becoming more and more focused on chasing that reward and spending more time on that activity when you'd be better off doing other things or thinking about other things. And then you feel more disappointment or frustration when you don't get that same level of input. And so doing a detox, taking a break from that thing until your brain kind of resets, can be certainly helpful. It parallels a lot of what we know about addiction and other areas.
Yeah. So your emotions are not so attached to external stimuli, right?
Right. And that, you're finding joy and getting those dopamine hits from things in your day-to-day life versus an outside stimulus. So
Right.
addiction is not necessarily in my wheelhouse. I generally work with kids 12 and under, but so that one doesn't come up as much. But yeah, that's a big talker in today's world with social media.
Totally. Well, especially with kids getting introduced to cell phones so early.
Hmm. Yeah,
What?
my daughter has been telling me, and this is maybe a sign of the conversations we have in our household, but she's 11 and she said, I don't ever want to get social media because I'm afraid I'll get addicted. She's afraid of scrolling and seeing something she doesn't want to see and then getting stuck on it. And well, that's actually a pretty reasonable, healthy fear, I guess. So I will roll with that. I'll hold off as long as possible. Trust me.
How old is it?
She's 11.
Wow, pretty smart.
She is. She's just a sharp one.
And when it comes to your work, what motivated you to start speaking and sharing your knowledge about these topics?
Sure. So I have been doing the clinical work of providing evaluations for families for over 10 years and really found myself in a corner of the psychology world um, where there wasn't any training. So I had always had an interest in autism. There's plenty of training on that. I it's not necessarily baked into a lot of clinical psych programs, but if you're interested in that topic, you can find a lot of training opportunities. Giftedness, I think it was less so. I became very interested in intellectual giftedness. So, in kids and individuals who have exceptional cognitive abilities in one or more areas. And then that fused with my interest in developmental disabilities. And I found that I was seeing a lot of kids who are what we call twice exceptional, so who are gifted, intellectually gifted. We have a very high IQ score, but also have a developmental disability like ADHD or autism or a learning disability. And that very kind of narrow niche corner of my field, there is next to no research and next to no training. And so I thought I really love this population. I relate to this population. I'm raising a child in this population. I would love to be part of the solution and provide training, provide educational resources, talk about it whenever anybody is interested in listening, um, to help bring more understanding to kids who are often misunderstood. And so that really became the mission of kind of my speaking, consulting, educational products is to help more people understand these often misunderstood kids.
Tell us a little bit more about that because when you mentioned that, I immediately thought about I don't know if you saw this recent movie about Dali, about Salvador Dali, but
I
yeah,
have not.
okay, he was a total genius, but you could also say he was a madman. But it's so weird how misunderstood he could be on a certain context or how much of a genius he could be. So,
Hmm.
yeah, tell us a little bit more what, I don't know, what problems do you see in this space? What challenges do you see in understanding kids with double giftedness?
Sure, twice exceptionality. And I'm be interested if anyone's listening to this podcast and they relate to this individually, to reach out. I'd be happy to share more resources because I would imagine there's a lot of very successful entrepreneurs who are highly gifted and also have ADHD or some other developmental difference, disability. Um, One thing that's helpful to understand about twice exceptional individuals is that oftentimes easy tasks are very hard for them, whereas hard tasks are very easy. So, for example, somebody who can complete advanced mathematical calculations in their mind might also be the same person who can't ever remember what they put their car keys.
Mm.
Or the child who can build these remarkable Lego structures, needs help with getting dressed in the morning. So the parents are kind of scratching their heads or more often like losing their minds because it feels like they have this kid who is purposely defying them or not trying hard enough to do these basic tasks based on the fact that they're so capable in these other areas. And so they come in having tried everything or feeling really frustrated and gaining more knowledge about their child's individual profile of strengths and weaknesses allows for some more understanding. So I can say to them, look, at what we've learned here through this evaluation process is they're exceptional in terms of their visual spatial processing and their ability to kind of engage in pattern reasoning. And so they can do A, B, C, and D really well and light years beyond their peers. And yet the part of their brain that's responsible for sequencing and kind of planning step 1, 2, 3 and prioritizing a task is underdeveloped or is, like a child much younger than them. And so what you have is a kid who's very capable in one area and really needing a lot more support in another area. And just something as simple as that kind of allows the understanding that, oh, they're not doing this to upset me or they're not defying me. It's that they don't have that skill. And it's really, and then it takes a lot of practice and adjusting as a parent because you have to continually remind yourself, okay, it's not that they're trying to upset me. It's that they need more support in this moment. So what do they need from me? They're having a hard time. They're not giving me a hard time. It's kind of a good mantra to go back to. The twice exceptional kids, they really need others to adjust their expectations for them constantly based on what are the task demands in that moment.
And it's not like they will outgrown this, right? Because I've heard that term in dyslexia. Like, no, just wait and they will outgrown their dyslexia.
No, and dyslexia specifically is one developmental disability where we generally know exactly what to do to help develop those parts of their brain responsible for reading skills. And there's solid research to back that up and actually rewires the brain if you do one of those research-based interventions. You can see it on MRI studies when individuals with dyslexia have had the appropriate intervention. So, in that specific case, yeah, you definitely wouldn't want to just sit around and wait. They need specific type of intervention to help them. And then, maybe they won't be the fastest, most prolific reader, and that's okay. Like they tend to kind of learn to read, and then they maybe read at a slower rate, or they often prefer audiobooks or other forms of getting their information, but you want them to be able to read at a level and rate that allows them to live day-to-day life comfortably and read when needed. So,
Right. It won't become a limitation.
right, exactly.
So if you could design like the perfect school, the perfect curriculum, how would that look like?
Well, that's a good question. Uh, the school system is set up as a system, and systems are intended to serve the most people as well as possible. And when you're a student who has a developmental disability, you often don't fit in that category of kind of it works well enough for me. And so what the school system in the United States has done is created a process where a student with an identified disability can qualify for what's called an individualized education plan, or an IEP. And so that's basically identifying that this is a student who's not served well by the standard system, and so they need something more individualized. And so the intention is to provide services and supports tailored to that student's specific needs. And oftentimes that's adequate. And I certainly meet a number of students where even that is, not necessarily adequate, or it's not being enforced properly, and they're still really struggling. So what's perfect is really going to vary by individual.
So those programs, what were the name?
Individualized education programs. So it's where the student is going to the same school, they may be pulled out for certain services. So a student with dyslexia might have an IEP where they come out of the classroom 3 or 4 days a week to get specialized reading intervention. And they may have support such as having worksheets read to them until they're able to do so on their own, or using assistive technology that allows the worksheets to be read to them, or using audiobooks.
And
so that way oh, go ahead.
No, you continue, please.
I was going to say that the intention is not for them to have these special advantages. It's to level the playing field. So a student in a wheelchair, you wouldn't say, like, work harder to get up those steps. Everyone else has to use the steps. Like, that's ridiculous, right? You'd give them a ramp or an elevator. And so for students with autism, for example, they don't need a ramp or an elevator, but they might need breaks from all the sensory input, or they might need more support around transitioning from one class to the next, or they might need some social downtime during lunch versus sitting with all the other kids. So it's really, again, depends on the individual, but there are services and supports to allow the student to access their education in the same way as their non-disabled peers.
Interesting. This topic is very fascinating. The kids with now they talk about empaths or highly sensitive people. Is that also a developmental condition, or what is it?
Sure. So that's the highly sensitive person, or the highly sensitive child. Dr. Elaine Aron is kind of the pioneer on that topic. She describes it as a trait that about 1 in 6 people have. If you think about, in most of our evolution, we lived in small tribes, and you had to have a few people on the tribe who picked up on any change in the social environment or the natural environment. Like, you needed to have some people who could notice if there was conflict brewing and could help support that, or if there was a change in the weather or a threat on the horizon. So it was adaptive to have a certain number of people who were highly attuned to their environment, who thought more deeply about things, who kind of kept everyone on a certain path and on a certain routine. But then you plop those same brains into 2024, right, where there's so much stimulation, and that same nervous system, that same brain doesn't know the difference between a threat on the horizon and something upsetting on your social media feed, for example. And so, like, highly sensitive people tend to they're just more highly attuned, they're absorbing more, they're feeling more, they're thinking more. And again, it's not a plus or a minus, it's just a part of how some people are wired that makes certain things, it can be very helpful or it can be a hindrance. So it's not a diagnosis, it's more, I talk to parents about, it's a description, but it can certainly help them to better understand their child. And more often than not, also, a parent relates to it because there's a genetic component. So I'll say, I'm guessing one or both of you can relate to this. And I usually get some big nods. It's really fun actually to see parents end up learning a lot about themselves through learning more about their child, which intuitively makes sense, but I don't think a lot of parents come into the process with that expectation and they end up of learning more about themselves too. But that's another tangent. But yeah, the high sensitivity piece, I see that a lot because there's overlap with a lot of developmental disabilities too in those traits.
Right. Interesting. So, what made you start your private practice in 2022?
I think it was a culmination of factors. So I'd been doing the clinical work for about 10 years. So I knew what I liked about it, what I loved about it, and what I wished I could change about it. The kind of the parts I felt were missing from the process. And in that same time frame, I went through breast cancer and had my own child was diagnosed with ADHD. And so it became a kind of this big aha moment of recognizing that developmental disabilities are learned about and studied in the framework of the medical model, which is kind of saying like, what are the symptoms? And then we diagnose those symptoms and we treat the symptoms and we want to cure things. And that doesn't work. Like developmental disabilities shouldn't be in that framework. So cancer should be. I wanted someone to say, here's what's wrong with you, and here's exactly how we're going to fix it. And so you can go back to being who you were in your life, and like being a healthy person. But we can't take that framework with kids with developmental disabilities, and doing so is actually harmful. Like how are we to expect someone to feel and do better if we start with, here's what's wrong with you and how we're going to fix it? And so my practice is called Developmental Discoveries because I don't think of it so much as a come into this medical practice, we're going to figure out what's wrong and we're going to fix it. It's more, let's discover what's going on for you in terms of your strengths and your challenges. And with more understanding, more information, then we can provide appropriate supports and services and kind of lean into who you are and recognize what's going to be more challenging and provide supports in those areas. And so kind of in that 2019, 2021, and then of course COVID provided a whole nother context for all of this and like the medical world and whatnot. Just had a burning desire to do neuropsych evaluations with kids in the way that I felt it could most ideally be done. And so started my own practice. And a big piece of it for me was including the child in the process. Like I want them to understand what we're doing. I
Mhm.
want them to have questions if they have questions. I want them to get their own feedback. And that was completely missing. That's missing from the standard process. I think that kids will do better when they're included and they can understand what we're learning about them because they're missing a lot of school for these appointments. And anyone can remember when they're a kid, if you miss school for an appointment, it's kind of a big deal. And these are long appointments. So I'm doing these long appointments with kids and then no one's telling them anything. And like they're smart. They know the adults are talking about them. They're missing all the school for these meetings and these tests. And then that's it. And then they kind of like they know something's going on, but no one's talking to them about it. And that was another big piece of why I wanted to do it my own way and have my own practice.
Interesting. And how has been the experience of running a business for you? Because I know you have like a big academic background. You did a doctorate, you came from the clinician world. How was that experience for you?
Hmm.
Mhm.
Humbling. Um, yeah, I kind of went into it knowing that it was going to be a huge challenge, but ready to take on a challenge and have taken it piece by piece as best as I can and reached out for help and used resources and consultants when I needed to. Um, it's only 2 years old this month. It's my business is turning two, so I like, thinking of it as like, from the developmental perspective, it's a toddler now, and it feels that way. So
Right.
I'm still, I mean, I think I'll always be learning, but Uh, I think the biggest lesson so far for me at this point is settling in to the experience of it. It's never going to hit a plateau. It's never going to be just uh, kind of consistently rolling along. Like there's always going to be ups and downs, and that's not a reflection on any failure on my part, that it's just a nature of the beast. And I hope that your listeners are nodding and validating that experience because that's kind of what my experience has been is like you kind of get a piece in place and you feel like that's great. Now I solved that problem. And then it's not too long later till something else pops up and then you're kind of starting that problem solving process over again, or you're growing and then you're trying to plug other holes. And it's just, that is the nature of it and sort of trying to settle into being okay with that and rolling with that.
Sure. But you do have like a small team. I saw you work with practitioners, you have a manager.
Mm-hmm. Yep, I have an office manager and a part-time administrative staff member who are wonderful. And then I have two other psychologists that work in my clinic, and we're adding another as we're growing kind of in the next couple months here into a new space. So there'll be four psychologists and two admin staff, and that's far more than I ever dreamed. So
Yeah.
I'm already kind of scaling beyond my own expectations, but kind of allowing it to happen organically and then catching up in terms of the business infrastructure piece.
Yeah, right. And I know it's not easy to always like reconcile a big mission with a business because, for example, my dad, he uses he does music therapy.
Mm.
So he teaches guitar, but as a way to heal and connect with your emotions, develop your social skills. And he's so passionate about that. But sometimes it is hard to convey that to people, to really have people understand why this is so powerful. Um, are there any like learnings that you have learned in your way of promoting a mission-driven organization and business?
Will you state the last part of that question again? There's ways that I.
For people who are trying to build a business,
Oh, sure.
mission-driven business,
Hmm.
what would be a piece of advice that you would give them?
Hmm. That's a wonderful question. My father always said, do what you love and the money will come. Um, and I suppose I have found that to be true. I think if you're doing something you really believe in, you go in with reasonable expectations and build from there is maybe the best thing that comes to mind in the moment because it's easy to dream so big, but you also have to deal in reality. So I think setting it up, like for me, I didn't start out like I'm going to open, a massive clinic, a multi-million dollar practice. Like I started myself and one other person because I knew I didn't want to be completely on my own. I like to consult and converse and one admin staff. And if that had stayed that at that level, that would have been fine with me because what's important to me is that I'm doing the work that I find is important and um, you know, just sharing that with my community and supporting the
Right.
people in my community. It just so happened the way things unfolded, it's grown. And so I think, yeah, just going into it, finding that balance between kind of your wildest dreams and where you are now, and sort of like what's the first step in that direction, and making sure you're taking it one step at a time and not getting too far ahead of yourself that you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot.
Right. They say
Yeah.
that overwhelm is the biggest threat to progress.
Absolutely. And I have experienced that a lot in the last year, especially kind of in the growing phases and changing phases. And
Right. So many
yeah,
decisions. That's where you really need to learn how to prioritize, manage yourself. All those basic skills that I guess I'm learning are important to learn from an early age.
absolutely. Right.
Um, Interesting. And about Instagram, do you use Instagram to drive business for developmental discoveries, or is it just like an experiment, a fun experiment for you? How do you use social media in your business?
Yeah, I started my professional Instagram about a little over 3 years ago, and my intention was to be able to provide more information and resources to the families I was serving. And over time, it's also become the intention of making more quality information accessible. So not everyone can afford a private evaluation, but at least I can offer this free resource to anyone who wants it. Um, I haven't ever paid for ads or done anything kind of marketing wise with it. I've just let it, I know I've picked it up for lengths of time, and I've put it down for lengths of time when I needed to. So I don't have any social media strategy or calendar I follow.
Yeah,
I've
it's like
just kind
awareness
of kept,
maybe.
I've just kept the pressure on that kind of low because I know myself. I'll get really wrapped up in it if I allow myself to. But
I
over
know.
3 years, it's grown to over 11,000, which is followers, which is small in the internet world, but it's way beyond any. I guess I never had a particular goal. It's just that's kind of where it's gone. And
Yeah.
now it's helped. It has helped. I get calls, we get calls in the clinic from around the country. And I've gotten, direct messages from people around the world looking for training or information for their part of the world on these topics that just are pretty niche topics.
Right.
So it's really fun. It's neat, and it feels very validating to get messages from people too saying this content, like I relate to it, or it helps me understand my child better. And whenever I get those messages, that's kind of the fuel in the fire to keep. Okay, good. I'll keep posting. I'll keep posting because likes are one thing, but when you've really connected with somebody,
Right.
that is very motivating.
Even if it's just one person, it's worth it.
Right. It really does. It has a big impact when people share those stories.
Interesting. The last question I wanted to ask you was about the brain building book. What is that?
Oh,
How does it work?
yeah. Okay, so as I said, part of what I wanted to do in my evaluation process was provide feedback for kids. And in other words, what did we learn about your brain through this process? What do we know about you? What have we learned about your strengths and what's more challenging for you? And really give them their individualized feedback. And I, at the same time as I was kind of creating this plan and process in my mind, I came across Dr. Liz Angoff, who is a psychologist who does the same work as I do, and she had kind of recognized the same problem. And she created these books that are, well, the one for younger kids is called the Brain Building Book. And it's essentially like a story that leaves space for writing in. It uses a construction metaphor. So it kind of says like your brain is amazing and it does all these different things and it's always under construction. And so it's learning, growing, building. And some of the roads in your brain are like highways where the information travels quickly and easily. So what are some of the highways in your brain? And so we'll fill a whole page with all the child's highways. Maybe it's creativity, maybe it's math, it's, any number of things. And then we say, and then there's areas that are still under construction. And so certain things might feel more frustrating or tiring. And here's what we learned about your brain in the areas that are under construction. And I try to keep that to like 3 bullet points. So for a child with ADHD, that might be like using my brakes, right? They're impulsive. It's hard to stop when I need to. Maybe it's trouble with focus. So again, like focusing really hard when I love something, but hard to focus when something's not that interesting. And maybe the third point is like having really big emotions and knowing how to manage my emotions. So then we go like, okay, and the next page is so what does this mean? What these highways and these construction zones, there's a name for that kind of brain, and it's ADHD. And so here's what we do. And it's just it's a book that helps talk them through what we've learned about their brain, and then they can add to it. They take it home. I've had kids say, can I bring this to my dance teacher? Can I show this to my coach? They'll take it to their therapist, and it's a way for them to continue the dialogue and kind of learn about themselves in an empowering way.
Right.
So highly recommend. Can't say enough good things about Dr. Liz Angoff. She's got tons of great resources. If you have a child with developmental disabilities, she's got a blog parents can follow, and links to all kinds of good resources on her page.
Sounds wonderful. So, Megan, where can people find more about you for speaking and also your private practice?
Sure. So the website for my private practice is developmental-discoveries.com. And there's a way to reach out to our clinic for scheduling evaluations. If you want to contact me for speaking opportunities, training, consultation, my email is drmeganpresents@gmail.com. So DRMEGAN presents@gmail.com. As you can tell, I love talking about these things. I could go all day. But I also have some infographics on my website. My other kind of mini entrepreneurial project I've been working on is I just basically went looking for a resource that didn't exist. I wanted an 8x11 infographic I could print out and give to families with kind of good go-to information and ideas. And those are $5 to download, so very accessible for most people. And you can download those through my website too.
Sounds amazing. Thank you so much for sharing this important message. Please, if you know, if the listener know someone who needs this information, please share this episode because every parent should know about this.
Oh, thank you so much. It was really wonderful to do this, and it's been so fun to learn more about business through your podcast.
If you enjoyed the show, hit the share button and send it over to one fellow marketer or entrepreneur. We work hard to make sure they'll thank you for it. Also, to get featured on the show, go to valuetising.com and apply to become our next guest. Until next time, keep valuetising.